There we go. Hi. So those of you who are, we really want to make this event conversational as much as possible, and we hope to be able to do that in our environment as well as in our format. So if you're sitting in the back, if you're comfortable moving forward, we would be really grateful for that. We know that people are going to be joining us throughout the morning, and so we hope to have a little bit of sense of community in here before we get started. So welcome, this is the TASH Inclusive Education Town Hall. My name is Jenny Stonemeyer. I'm the Director of Education Policy for TASH. We're really excited to engage in this conversation this morning, but we want to take a couple minutes to orient people to the process. Because we at TASH have never done a town hall. We've never had a session, an event with this kind of format. So today's town hall is going to be a brief discussion and description of hypothetical students in a hypothetical school environment. We're going to use a scenario followed by some data to set the conversation with our panelists and our federal partners, during which we will discuss 3 critical questions that are listed on your agenda, and then brief presentations on each question from our panel of experts. We're pleased to have the participation today of key leadership from the Department of Education, whom we'll introduce properly in just a moment. And we look forward to your thoughts and perspectives and insights as well. We want to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in today's event. So we have folks in the audience. You may have you definitely walked past a table in the back of the room that had today's agenda and also had index cards. So to manage the conversation and the questions today, we are asking people to submit questions on index cards. So if you haven't grabbed a couple, please feel free to do that now. We also have 2 of our wonderful committee members who are available to pass them out. Once you have your question, if you could raise the card and someone will come and pick it up to you, and will then manage the questions during the time that's allowed. Deb Delisle is the Assistant Secretary from the Department of Education and is the Principal Advisor to the Secretary of Education on all matters related to pre-K, elementary, and secondary education. Previously, Deb was a Senior Fellow at the International Center for Leadership in Education, served as Ohio's 35th State Superintendent of Public Instruction, as well as a District Superintendent, Principal, and Teacher. She has served on a multitude of boards, including the Council of Chief State School Officers and the NCATE Executive Board, and the governing boards of the Midwest Regional Education Lab and the Minority Student Achievement Network. Deb has been the recipient of many honors, including the Cleveland Heights University Heights City School District, recognizing her lifetime of service to students by dedicating a school as the Deborah S. Delisle Education Options Center. Thanks, Deb, for joining us. So, we had slides. We had a conversation with the assistants for each of our federal partners, who were very excited about the opportunity to engage in a Twitter conversation. So we want to be sure that we have the Twitter handle. So I'm going to see if I can run back and correct the slides during our conversation, so we can have that part of it. Okay. Catherine Lehman is the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. President Obama nominated her for the position on June 10, 2013. She was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate on August 1st of 2013. Immediately prior to joining the department, Catherine was the Director of Impact Litigation at Public Counsel, the nation's largest pro bono law firm. Before that, she participated for a decade at the ACLU of Southern California, ultimately as Assistant Legal Director. Earlier in her career, Lehman was a teaching fellow and supervising attorney in the appellate litigation program at Georgetown University Law Center. and after clerking with the Honorable William A. Norris on the United States Court of Appeals in the Ninth Circuit. In 2004, California Lawyer named Lehman Attorney of the Year for Civil Rights. The Daily Journal listed her as one of top 20 California lawyers under 40 in 2007, and as one of the state's top women litigators in 2010 and 2007. Lehman received her JD from Yale Law School, where she was the Outstanding Women Law graduate, and she graduated summa cum laude from Amherst College. So welcome. Melody Musgrove grew up in Mississippi, a child of public school teachers. She worked as a classroom teacher, school administrator, district special education director, and assistant superintendent before serving as state director of special education for Mississippi Department of Education until January of 2007. She then moved to the private sector as director of business development for LRP Publications, the nation's leading publisher of legal and regulatory guidance for educators. Dr. Musgrove was selected by the White House to be the director of the Office of Special Education Programs for the U.S. Department of Education and assumed the role in 2010. OSEP is responsible for providing leadership to the early intervention and educational agencies serving our nation's 6.7 million infants, toddlers, children, and youth under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Dr. Musgrove's career is distinguished by her commitment to collaborative frameworks that find creative solutions to difficult educational problems. She is focused on improving outcomes for all children and experienced in using data to influence systemic improvement decisions. Since becoming director, Dr. Musgrove has been leading OSEP staff through a thoughtful process in collaboration with stakeholder groups to change the way OSEP works and to shift, as Secretary Arne Duncan has said, from a compliance-driven bureaucracy to an engine of innovation. That is focused on improving results for children and families. So welcome, Melody. I'm going to clear my throat because I'm going to be talking for a while. Okay. So by way of grounding our conversation today, I wanted to remind everybody here of a couple of the following facts. According to the Americans with Disabilities Act, students with disabilities are entitled to be free from discrimination. According to the Individuals, I'm going to read that again because that's important. According to the Americans with Disabilities Act, students with disabilities are entitled to be free from discrimination. According to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, they are to be provided an equal opportunity to learn what other students are expected to learn. Given these two facts, this town hall will explore what high-quality inclusive education looks like and the benefits to students with and without disabilities. In addition, we will discuss fundamental needs for communication for every student and how least restrictive environment decisions can support student outcomes. So we're going to tell you a little story. This scenario illustrates the power of universal design, creative and respectful behavior supports, family engagement, and accommodations and modifications that enable students with intensive support needs to learn grade-level Common Core state standards. Ms. Wendell has been our hypothetical teacher. Ms. Wendell has been a little nervous at the beginning of the school year because 2 students were coming into her 3rd grade class. She worked well with all students in her class and was known for providing excellent supports for students with special needs. However, Eric and Jack's needs were a little more intense than she was used to, and she had no experience with the alternate assessment and was worried that it would require a lot of isolated instruction based on different standards or curriculum. She was both relieved and unsure of how things would progress when she learned that Eric and Jack would need the same type of grade-level standards aligned instruction that she provided to all students. In the beginning of the year, she met with the special education teacher and Eric's family, as well as his classroom teacher from the year before. They talked about Eric's strengths and areas of need, and everyone agreed that for Eric, some additional behavior supports were going to be necessary. Ms. Wendell used a system of table points, whereby points are awarded collectively to groups of students, and responsive behavior supports for all of her students. However, those who knew Eric were concerned that his frequent outbursts and need to stand up during classwork would cause his table to lose points, and thus potentially get his table mates upset with him. Ms. Wendell explained that with a few exceptions, students were given choices on where they could do their work, and if Eric needed to stand to do his, then that would not be a problem. However, they developed a personal behavior support system to help him monitor talking out in class. A set of class rules were taped to his desk as well as being posted on the classroom wall. And his parents helped develop and practice a social story so he would know what was expected in Ms. Wendell's room and why. At the beginning of the year, Ms. Wendell was concerned about what it would take for Jack to do, was concerned about what she could do for Jack academically. She had seen Jack around the school in grades 1 and 2 and knew that he had a sweet smile, had lots of friends who helped to help him navigate his motorized wheelchair through difficult spots if he needed it. But Jack was still working on building a communication system, and she wasn't sure that being in classroom, learning math and science and reading was really the right place for him. She met with the inclusion facilitator and last year's teacher to candidly share her concerns before they met with Jack's grandmother. They discussed the fact that the law states that all students should be working on accessing and making progress toward the general education standards, and while Ms. Wendell agreed that was very important, she worried about how she could make grade-level instruction accessible for Jack. She had participated in some school-wide professional development on Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, and began to seek out other resources to support her use of these principles. The class was working on a combined math and science lesson that involved studying the habitat of indigenous and non-indigenous animals around them and conducting some research about the animals and plants in the local environment. As a part of the lesson, Ms. Wendell typically planned a nature walk in the woods behind the school. However, given Jack's need for wheelchair-accessible areas and her concern of taking Eric out of the typical school routine, she had a meeting with the inclusion facilitator to figure out how to make the lesson more universally as well as individually designed. They decided they would work with Eric's parents to develop some social stories in addition to the whole class preparation that Ms. Wendell did for everyone, outlining the expectations and roles for the environmental survey. They would have the class work in teams of 2 or 3 and considered carefully the students' strengths and needs as they made teams. They would also divide the class in half and give each student a choice of a meadow survey or a wood survey, and the inclusion specialist would join the class for the activity. The meadow was flat enough that Jack's chair could navigate far enough into to get a spot where he could conduct his own survey with a partner. As part of helping Jack learn to use the speech-generating AAC device, the speech-language pathologist had gone through the academic theme for the quarter and identified some core vocabulary that Jack would need. She focused on a combination of descriptors and object words so that he could eventually combine words to make new concepts. For instance, black bird, red bird, etc. He had color words, a few animals, round, straight, and the numbers 0 through 5, in addition to the typical core vocabulary found at the beginning AAC screens. These words had provided opportunities for Jack to regularly participate in math and science lessons related to animal habitat, geometry, graphing, and problem solving that were the main focus of his quarter. Ms. Wendell used principles of UDL, multiple means of action and expression and engagement, to design the environmental survey. Each team of students were to find as many animals as they could and create representations, pictures, tally marks, graphs, etc., to keep track of what they found and how many. Back in the classroom, they worked in small groups to choose what they considered to be the best way to represent the data and why, and did some research either together or alone to learn more about the animals they saw. Students were given a graphic organizer to help them complete their research. Jack used his AAC device to tell his partner how many bars should be shaded for each type of bird they saw, and was able to work on counting concepts of more and less, answering questions using a graph, one-to-one correspondence, and even color recognition as part of his portion of the graphing exercise. When other students were creating number problems based on the graph, Jack was identifying the graph that best matched the problem. For the research, Jack and his partner decided they wanted to learn about, and together they chose the book they thought would be helpful. The partner read the text to Jack, and Jack worked with the speech-language pathologist to identify the answers to specific questions from the text. Eric worked with his team to complete their graph. Like many of the students in the class, he used task analysis to create and answer basic number problems using the graph. For example, how many red birds and blue birds were there altogether? However, Ms. Wendell also made sure to work with him on some more basic concepts, such as more and less as well. Eric chose to work by himself on the research and used the internet and a text reader to help him read some of the passages. Ms. Wendell had 3 basic options for graphic organizers available to the students. She handed Eric the most simplified graphic organizer. When he began to get frustrated about the writing the information, a paraprofessional was available to scribe his notes for him. She then helped him identify only the most important information. Each student was assessed by the completeness of their graphic organizer, whether their graph was completed correctly, and if the answers to the questions related to the graph were correct. Ms. Wendell typically had options for how students could complete work, and in this lesson found several options for the graphic organizers. Also, she had used the graphing activity as an opportunity to let her students make mistakes without penalty. There were 8 questions on most of the worksheets. Jack had only 3. But the students only had to complete 5. However, extra questions would not count against you, but could be added as extra credit. The research was scored using a rubric that included the research process, summarizing your findings, and presenting the information. Using UDL principles, Ms. Wendell did not specify how students completed these 3 tasks: books, internet, PowerPoint, posters, papers, etc., only that they did so to a set degree of completeness and level of detail. Because the work and the rubric utilized UDL, and given that their IEPs stated accommodations and supports, Jack and Eric were able to be scored using the same rubric. Ms. Wendell was pleased at the end of the year to learn that questions addressing the same skills and concepts, like the ones she had developed for this activity, were included in the alternate assessment. Students taking the alternate assessment were expected to be able to read and answer questions about a graph, identify or develop and answer number sentences that went with a story, and answer questions about what they had read or had been read to them. In terms of reflection, Ms. Wendell met with the principal for her end-of-year evaluation and discussed how her personal improvement plan supported the school-wide goals and steps for future professional development. The school's goals included supporting all students in inclusive classrooms through the use of UDL, behavior supports, family engagement, grade-level aligned, age-appropriate accommodations and modifications. Ms. Wendell's work to incorporate UDL and make appropriate lesson accommodations, as well as her work with the whole team, including the family, to develop positive behavior plans, supports the school-wide goals. In addition, Ms. Wendell worked closely with the SLP, speech-language pathologist, and the family to increase Jack's ability to communicate and be actively engaged in grade-level aligned, age-appropriate lessons. They identified some additional joint goals with Ms. Wendell and the SLP to further support building a communication system for all students, and identified some opportunities for Ms. Wendell to provide job-embedded professional development to others in the areas of UDL and grade level aligned age-appropriate accommodations and modifications. So April Register, I'm going to introduce her. She's going to join us as our moderator. April is co-chair of the Inclusive Education Committee. The word just fell out of my head. And she's also a board member with TASH. She's also a professor at the University of Missouri at St. Louis in the area of special education. So April is going to be our moderator for the remainder of the session. That's big green to advance, little red to go back. Okay, your water's right there.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. This is a great event. It's really great to see everybody here, and thank you so much to all of you who are presenting and those of you that are here to respond. So thank you. So the scenario that Jenny presented really illustrates a picture of relative success. However, I think all of us here know that all too often students with the most significant impact of disability are not afforded these kinds of educational opportunities that we described. The data tells us that 95% of students with intellectual disabilities receive their education in segregated environments. We also know that students with disabilities are more than twice as likely to receive an out-of-school suspension, 13%, than students without disabilities, who are 6%. According to the National Center and State Collaborative, 31% of students taking the alternate assessment are not yet using symbolic language. And of those students, 60% have no access to communication system. So really our time here today will be talking about what we know takes place, the scenario, what we know can happen in the vision that is so much a part of TASH in the scenario that she presented. But looking at this data, we have a lot of work to do, and how do we address that work? So as a reminder of the process today, we're going to pose 3 critical questions and have brief presentations on each of those questions from panel experts. So I'll introduce each of those experts, who will talk for around 3 to 5 minutes around these questions. We'll then follow each presentation with key leadership perspectives from the Department of Education, where they will have a chance to respond and talk about these questions, and then we'll open it up as well using those index cards. So if you write a question or something that you want to say, please put that down on the index cards and wave it up, and somebody will come around to pick those up and bring them up to the front. Our first question posed will be followed by a presentation by Luann Land from the University of Kentucky. And the question that we are posing is, how do we ensure that every child has achieved communication competence by age 5? So, Luann?
Good morning. I was going to start out with some of the data, but we had some of the data presented, so that's great. The groundwork has been set. Within that data, what we're really finding is that approximately 10% of students that participate in the alternate assessments are leaving high school, anywhere from 18 to 21, without a communication system in place. And that's a big concern. So that's why our goal of all students communicating by kindergarten. The other thing the data shows is that There are 70% of the students in alternate assessment who have symbolic language, but the 30% who either have emerging symbolic language, which is they have some receptive responses that we recognize, but it's inconsistent and it needs to build so that a lot of the behaviors are idiosyncratic, et cetera. And then we have students who have no observable expressive communication in recognizable other than things like cries and smiles. And that data doesn't change across the school years. So it stays the same. Elementary, we have 30% of students. Middle school, high school. So the reason we want communication by kindergarten is because 30% of the students coming into school, and this is data from 3rd grade, so they've already been in school for several years, 30% of our students still do not have communication systems. And of that 30%, as was stated here, 60% don't even have access to an AAC system. And we need to figure out why that is. Why do we have students who have made it all the way to 3rd grade or all the way to the end of high school and are graduating and still do not have access to AAC? I think part of that is there are some myths that we need to dispel. One is being ready for communication. The child's not ready. They need this, this, and this first. Everybody's ready for communication. If we believe everybody communicates, and I know at the University of Kentucky, we truly believe that. The thing is, we aren't recognizing the output. We aren't recognizing a student's intent, and we really need to start looking at that. So that's one myth, students aren't ready, but if we truly believe everyone communicates, we're ready. The other myth is that a lot of people seem to have the belief that AAC inhibits the development of oral speech. And that's one of our dangerous myths because it's the totally opposite. AAC helps support the development of oral speech if a student is going to be an oral speech user. And so we have AAC, it's available. This day and age, it's easier to use, it's more affordable, and it's more available than ever before. And the other thing is, theoretically, these students who are in the alternate assessment who are getting to 3rd grade without communication have had a lot of pre-service intervention as well. So it's not just 3 years of schooling that they've made it through without communication, but it's all their pre-service intervention as well. Another thing mentioned is where students are educated. So a lot of our students are educated in more secluded settings with other students who aren't communicating. One of, I think, the most enlightening research I've read about recently is the 30 million word gap. That information is amazing, and it's based on more of students from lower income levels and how they come to school with a 30 million word deficit compared to other students of higher income levels. And I think about that in terms of students with disabilities and what the word gap must be for them. And the word gap basically occurs, it's related to the amount of exposure to language, to words, to how we talk to our children, and how we use, am I over my 5 minutes? Wow, 5 minutes goes by fast. All right, I just have to say one thing then. One major thing we have to remember is that communication is an essential life skill. And if we continue to let students leave school without communication, they're at risk for poor post-school outcomes at best, and neglect and abuse at the worst. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Luann. Boy, does time just fly when you're hearing good information. So at this point, we'd really like to hear some responses, and we thought maybe we would start with Catherine. And remember, if you have questions or things, please, raise up your hand, and someone will come by and collect those. We'll get to those after we hear from our federal partners.
Great, thanks so much, and thank you all for joining us for this town hall discussion. And these are obviously all really critical questions. This first question hits home for me, both as a mom and as the chief civil rights enforcer for the Department of Education. I know as a mother of 2 girls in elementary school that we really need early intervention and early identification of needs. And so the statistics that we all heard are really distressing, and the point is right about what happens when our kids finish school without being able to communicate, but the life in school, for all the years that they are in school without being able to communicate, is pretty harrowing as well. So, what we really want to do is identify early what the communication needs are and make sure that we are aggressively supporting what those needs are. And happily, there's a confluence of laws that come together to really provide supports for our students in schools. And so when we have done that identification, when we really believe in each of our kids as a learner, and we support our kids in school, we can get there so that all of our kids are communicating by age 5 and communicating throughout their school years, which is what we want for every child. So what are the things that come together that we want to see in schools? Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which my office enforces, requires that preschools cannot exclude students based on disability. So first, we have access for all of our kids to preschool, which is really important for the beginning of learning. Then the IDEA requires that the provision of free and appropriate public education begins at age 3. So we also have the assurance in preschool of access to the free and appropriate public education. And Title II of the ADA does require effective communication. And we just, together with OSERS and with the Department of Justice, released guidance that we hope cements what it is that we expect for effective communication delivery for students in schools. And that includes primary consideration of the family's desires and active support for communication needs for students. And so when we have that overlay of the laws and we actually see it lived in the experience of our students, we actually can deliver the education that all of our kids need. And I just want to highlight one example from the last few years about a preschool communication investigation and result that my office conducted. There was a student who did not have verbal communication skills, who was in preschool, and whose rehabilitation services agency had given the student an iPad to help the student communicate in school, but his preschool wasn't allowing him to take that iPad home, and also wasn't using it for communication for him. They were using it for other needs for other students in the school. So we investigated, we ensured that he had the supports that he had been provided, and that he had full services available to him, and that the school considered what compensatory education needed to be provided to make up for the lost time for that student. So, really distressing to hear about that fact pattern for a student in school who actually had been provided supports but wasn't able to access them. And we really were thrilled to be able to be there for him, and hope to be able to be there for other kids who need it like that, and would like to see more and more schools delivering those needs without the arm of the federal government, although we're happy to be the muscular arm when we need to be. So I'll stop there and see if Melanie or Deb want to add.
The only thing I would add to this whole issue is just this intense focus that certainly this administration is bringing to quality, and I want to emphasize the word quality before preschool programs. The president put forth a $75 billion proposal last year, I'm feeling like it's forever ago, last year, which of course did not get funded. And so, yeah, unfortunately, but through our Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grants, we're announcing a new round, and so as of next week, we will have 18 states who are really committed to increasing the quality of preschool programs, and those are all reliant on making sure that they are very inclusive environments. But this issue of quality is really one that's pretty significant across the country. I'm sure that you've walked into some preschool programs and you sort of shudder and think, I don't think I would want my own kid in this program, but we somehow allow them to be okay for other people's kids. So we have spent an enormous amount of time focusing on quality and rigor within that preschool program setting, in addition to inclusivity. So That just is really an essential part of this communication strategy, certainly, and getting kids feeling not just that they can find a rightful place in school as they enter kindergarten and continue on their learning trajectory, but certainly that they feel good about that placement in their school. They feel that they're included, that they're an essential part of every classroom and every learning activity.
Thanks, and thank you for being here this morning. And I just have to take a point of personal privilege here and say what an honor it is for me to be here with Deb and with Catherine. I know you don't really see the way we work together, but we have, I think, an unprecedented partnership. We have a great relationship. I mean, just evidenced by some of the things we've been able to accomplish. As Catherine mentioned, the Effective Communication Letter. My team has been very involved in the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant. I mean, so we are doing so much together and have a great partnership, and I just want to publicly say how much I appreciate that partnership. But, clearly, early intervention is absolutely critical, and, we have Part C is still optional. It should be required. That something we really need to be looking at and encouraging. I can't tell you to talk to Congress about it, but we know that it is very important to have. That is a program that is absolutely critical. If we don't get early intervention for kids who need it, the chances of long-term success are greatly diminished. Likewise, and plus Part C is so woefully underfunded, as well as the 619 preschool program. Those are two critical programs that can play a role in the improved not just school outcomes but life outcomes for kids with disabilities. So those programs are critical. I am very optimistic that the new assessments that are much more accessible are going to give us much better information around kids with disabilities. Not only that, but the new alternates are really driving teachers to focus much more on discovering how kids can communicate. We had, initially, well, and still, as you know, there's a lot of pushback around assessments, in particular assessing kids with the most significant disabilities, especially children who do not have effective communication. So there was a state that was considering a state law to basically exempt kids with significant disabilities from their assessment. And so the lieutenant governor of that state asked us if we could pull together a conference call with some members of the consortia that are working on alternate assessments, and we said, sure, we'd love to do that. It was the most powerful call that I've been on in a very long time. We had teachers from around the country who are working with students who do not have effective communication, and the stories that we heard, there's no way that I could have told those stories the way the teachers did, saying that because of the assessment, I started trying to figure just what is it, and they would notice the movement of a thumb, the movement of their jaw or something like that, that even the parents oftentimes had not noticed, and then they were able to establish communication. So I think that just these new alternate assessments being, I think, much broader and more accessible are encouraging teachers of kids with, with intellectual disabilities, without communication, to really focus much more on how kids can effectively communicate. So, the jury is still out on those assessments. Of course, they've been field tested, and so we're really looking at full implementation, but I am very optimistic that they're going to lead to, better communication earlier for more children, because we know it's absolutely critical.
So we have a couple questions here. How might we move from adapting to the UDL models of educating students in inclusive contexts?
So, we are we've been funding a number of investments for some time around universal design. Frankly, there are several things. One, I think our moving to results-driven accountability is really forcing our effort is to force states and local school districts to look at their data and determine why are children with disabilities so low performing in those, and who are those children? Is it because they're not accessing the general curriculum? Is it because they're in segregated settings? And so really looking more closely at who are the children and why are they not performing, and then designing supports and designing, coming up with plans to improve the performance and really address those core root cause issues. So I think that's, really important. But also the preparation of teachers. We are all very focused on teacher and leader preparation. And, it's just universal design is slowly becoming more common, but it's not new. It should be an integral part of every teacher's training, not just special ed, but general ed teachers should, because all kids benefit from instruction that's universally designed, not just kids with disabilities. We know that when kids with disabilities get what they need in a general ed setting, other kids in that setting do much better as well. So this has got, and we're, through all of our investments in OSEP and personnel preparation, we are insisting upon that. But again, that we're funding a very small percentage of the teacher prep programs in this country. So, I think there's got to be pressure from the field. There's got to be pressure from schools saying this is what we need from the teachers who are coming out of your preparation programs. When I travel the country, every school I visit, I ask the administrators in that school, are the teachers you get from teacher preparation programs ready to teach on day one when they enter your classroom? 98% of the time, 99% of the time, they say no. That teachers come out of teacher preparation not knowing how, just general ed and special ed teachers, not knowing how to do progress monitoring, not knowing how to differentiate instruction, not knowing universal design, not knowing inclusive education, inclusive strategies. Okay, that's just not acceptable. And in the one or two occasions when I've had administrators say, actually they are ready on day one. I said, what is different about those programs? When, everywhere else I go, they say, no, we spend a ton of money and time retraining teachers. And they said because they have a minimum 1.5 year long clinical internship in inclusive settings. And they have a combination that is general ed and special ed trained together, not separate. So, that is so important, and we've got to do more. But you can help us by putting pressure, on our programs to do a better job with that.
Great. We have time for about one more question here, and I just want to make sure and acknowledge the fact that we are receiving the questions. We wouldn't, for time's sake, we wouldn't be able to get to everything. So please continue to send them in, because we will be actually using audio from today to develop a white paper on our discussion, and I think these questions are very important and could be included in that. So last question around this, which really was discussed by Luann. How can we disseminate information to the public, families, and schools to counter that myth that the use of AAC devices impedes development of verbal speech? Can we engage mainstream media, perhaps?
Number one, I think through our parent centers, the PTIs in states, we can encourage them to distribute more information around that. Frankly, I have no idea where that, I have not heard that very often. That's just one of the silliest things. To think that a communication device impedes, verbal communication is just counterintuitive to me. But anyway, I think our parent centers, certainly again through our preparation programs, I think there's so much that's done in our preparation programs to set the stage for how educators view their work once they're out there in the field. Clearly leaders are important. Principals are the ones who are really setting the culture in schools very often, and so they need more information as well. We'd be happy to, to partner with you any way we can to try to get more information out there. I'm sure that ASHA is also very involved in this. So, any way that we can get more information out, we'd be happy to partner with you all.
Great. So, our second question that we're considering today is the question of how can descriptive measures be used by schools so that their LRE, the least restrictive environment, reflects an equitable education that assures participation and progress in the general education curriculum in the age-appropriate general education classroom. It's a mouthful. But we have invited Norma Day Vines, the Vice Provost for Faculty at Johns Hopkins University, to help really lead us in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to address TASH this morning. I do want to make a correction. I'm on the faculty in the Counseling and Human Development Program at Hopkins. Dr. Cheryl Holcomb McCoy is the Vice Provost of faculty. In any case, I do want to start out by talking about what is cultural competence and what are we referring to when we talk about cultural competence. And in general, we're talking about a congruent set of policies, practices, structures that come together in a school or a school system to work more equitably to help students from culturally distinct groups. When we talk about cultural competence, we're talking about value orientations and respecting those value orientations. Ironically, as the discussion was just centering on, when we look at universities across the country, a report by NCATE several years ago noted that only 56% of institutions that were surveyed actually address cultural diversity in a significant and substantive manner. So what does that mean? When teachers get out into the field, they may not really understand what cultural competence means. And when people do not have opportunities to interact with people outside of their own origins or people who are different from them in many different ways, they may have a less of an understanding and an appreciation for diversity. There are a number of models that are out there that help us look at and understand and conceptualize cultural competence. A popular model is by Papadopoulos from Hopkins. It was based on a nursing model, but it has since been adopted to schools. And it's a four-pronged model that includes cultural awareness, cultural knowledge, cultural sensitivity, and cultural competence. When we talk about cultural awareness, basically we're talking about looking at our own attitudes, biases, and assumptions. What are they, and how do they impact our learning? Because one of the things we know is that our implicit attitudes guide and direct our behavior. So when we look at Mrs. Wendell, and she has the two students coming to her classroom, her implicit assumption may be that all students can learn except the two students from the special education program coming in. And if she has those attitudes, fortunately she doesn't, based on, fortunately she doesn't, but if she has those attitudes, how will that impact her treatment of the children in her classroom? And as the instructional leader in that classroom, what is she communicating indirectly, both explicitly and implicitly, to children in the classroom? So when we talk about understanding our own attitudes, biases, and assumptions, we need to explore them in a safe way so that we talk honestly and openly about what our biases are and then begin to extirpate them. We cannot do anything with our biases if we do not acknowledge them. So cultural awareness is important. When I teach a course on cultural competency at both the master's level and the doctoral level, and one of the things I have students do is go to Harvard University and look at the implicit attitudes tests where they get a measure, they're able to take a survey and that measures their implicit attitudes and assumptions. And that's sort of quantitative data that could give them some sense of their attitudes and behaviors and how they may begin to tackle them. I come from a counseling program, so throughout the counseling curriculum, we're constantly talking about how our biases may impact our effort to work effectively with children and adolescents. The second component of Papadopoulos' model is cultural knowledge, and when we talk about cultural knowledge, we're talking about the acquisition of factual information about learners from diverse and marginalized groups. And so it's important to know that there is often a lack of synchronicity between children from mainstream groups and children from non-mainstream groups. And so as educators, as teachers, it's important for us to understand how those value orientations differ. There's not sort of a shared experience around experiences with education, social class positionality, attitudes towards education, immigration status. All of those things are very important, and if we don't understand how and why children and families come to schools, it's really going to be difficult to navigate that terrain. A third area is cultural sensitivity, and basically we're talking about strategies for working more equitably and developing partnerships that promote acceptance and respect. And one of the ways that we can do that is by bringing people together, stakeholders, multidisciplinary teams of people together to sort of consider those issues that need to take place in schools. Finally, there is this notion of cultural competence or cultural skills? How do we integrate awareness, knowledge, skills in a meaningful way that we identify practices that better impact our children? One of the ways that we can do it is through professional development, but not in the conventional way, because having worked as a school counselor many years ago, most of the professional development I received was more like spray and pray, that things would work out. And what we need are more intensive models. The models that I've been working with more recently involve not only teaching through professional development, but ongoing professional development that involves coaching, where teachers are paired with individuals that may be more expert, that will guide them through some of the concerns that they have in classrooms. Finally, I want to say, inasmuch as we train teachers to develop the requisite awareness, knowledge, and skills to work more effectively with children from marginalized groups, it's important that we begin to have an impact on the children in schools. When we talk about having a greater appreciation for inclusive classrooms, it's not enough for the teachers to have these attitudes and values and appropriate behaviors. We've got to inculcate children in classrooms, in general ed classrooms, to have a greater appreciation for children with differences in learning styles. So I just want to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora. And I apologize. We thought we updated all of our slides at the last minute and apparently missed. So thank you. So we'd like to offer an opportunity for a response, and I thought, Melody, if you would like to start on this.
So this is a really we could talk the rest of the time about spend this on just this one question. So I'll try to be brief and be strategic. As Norman just mentioned, the whole issue of cultural sensitivity, cultural competence is so important for teachers. I mean, we all have biases, right? I mean, we all do. We just have to recognize them and not let them influence our decisions. And again, I think that's something that we have to be aware of and be constantly dealing with. And I'm from the South, so I see that administrators in the South are particularly reluctant to deal with the whole issue of the overrepresentation of students with disabilities, and particularly students of color, in suspension and expulsion and other punitive measures of discipline. The civil rights data, OCR's data collection, that so graphically and clearly points out how students with disabilities are subjected to much more severe discipline practices than other students, and if they are male and of color, then the likelihood of ending up in juvenile justice and other negative situations completely it is exponentially increased. So I think we've got to do much more about focusing our efforts again in results-driven accountability. If it is because students with disabilities are being suspended and expelled and removed from the classroom more, then that is something the state should have to deal with. If you have not been involved in your state's, the development of their state systemic improvement plan, I encourage you to call them up and see how you can get access to that. We have been strongly, encouraging and actually requiring that there be stakeholder involvement in that process, and so, I think that's absolutely critical if states are going to be able to deal with some of these really sticky, difficult issues. So we really encourage you to get involved in that. And there'll be other opportunities to talk about this more. I'm going to stop and let someone else talk.
I think we should try to hear from the audience. Okay.
Great. So we have a few questions that are great at really getting at this consideration. So how can some of our known quality indicators for inclusive education be tied to enforcement of IDEA? No.
Read that question again, would you please? Yeah. I'll make sure I heard that right. So.
How can some of our known quality indicators for inclusive education be tied to enforcement of IDEA?
Well, That's difficult because, as you know, the law requires least restrictive environment. It doesn't require that every student be in general education for all the time. So, that's, as we know, leaving the decisions to IEP teams is, a critical piece of IDEA. But that doesn't mean that IEP teams have unlimited authority to do things that are not in the best interest of children. It just drives me crazy when I go into schools and I, hear a teacher say or an administrator say, we want to take you to see our inclusion class or our inclusion program or whatever, because that's, okay, right there that something's off the rails, right? Because, something ran amok, because there's no such thing as an inclusion class or inclusion, inclusion is a culture, and the smallest meaningful unit of inclusion is a school. That's as small as it gets. You can't get down to the grade level, the class level, it's either inclusive or it's not. And when you walk in the door whether or not that's an inclusive school. It'd take you less than 5 minutes, and because if you see kids with disabilities involved in everything in that school, you also know immediately from talking to the principal. You can just know by the way they talk about the programs and the children within their school. Either they say, we value every kid who comes through our door, we teach kids, not labels, and we're going to make sure that every kid is meaningfully included in the culture of our school. I mean, you can see that very clearly. And so I think, it's really incumbent not only on us, but on, on parents, on communities. Let's face it, very often schools are sort of a microcosm of the communities that they're in. If you don't have an inclusive community, then very often the schools are not going to be inclusive either. So, I mean, this is obviously a much bigger, society problem than just an education. I think we're going to be looking much more closely at how we are doing, we're changing the way we monitor states, because it's always been kind of a cyclical system where we go see a state every 4 or 5 years, no matter what's going on in that state. Now it's going to be based on outcomes and what's happening in states in terms of how students with disabilities are learning and growing and getting the knowledge and skills that they need. I'm so excited about a project that we funded. I guess it's about to start in its 3rd year, and TASH is a partner in that, and that's our SWIFT project. The grantee is the University of Kansas, School-Wide Integrated Framework for Transformation. In a nutshell, it's whole school inclusive reform. It's how do you put aside the labels, look at the resources of a school, and deploy those in a way that makes sure that all kids get what they need, without regard for whether they're Title I, they're special ed, they're 504. Those don't matter. It's not the labels that matter, but and all kids should be going and coming from interventions throughout the year based on the skills that they need, not based on their labels. So, and actually SWIFT is doing this work as was mentioned earlier. It's very labor intensive. I mean, Norma mentioned the importance of having coaches, and that is exactly what they are doing. I mean, if teachers knew how to do this well, knew how to teach children with disabilities well, they would be doing it. They don't know how. And it's very labor intensive to show them how. You have to hold their hands and change the way they think, change the way they work. And that's what SWIFT is doing. And so we're really excited about the kind of groundbreaking work that they're doing around, finding out what is the right model and how do we make this work in a way that we can scale it up to all schools.
I'm going to expand the question a little bit. I don't enforce IDEA, but I do enforce 504 and the ADA. And so, thinking in those frames, I just want to tell a couple of stories from some recent enforcement examples. We had a school district in Colorado that had referred their students with disabilities to a learning lab, and they had no teacher in that learning lab, and the kids were sitting by themselves in a essentially non-school environment, not really learning. So, we had to go in and say that that's actually not appropriate for kids in school, and they need teachers and they need to be instructed, and you actually do need to have a group of people who know the kids come together and think about what's the appropriate learning environment for those kids. So that doesn't happen anymore. I'm really thrilled about that. I'm horrified by the fact that I have to describe it at all. But we're very aggressive about saying that's not really appropriate. Another change that's relatively recent for us in our office is, as Melody said, we do need to let the the IEP team make a set of decisions for kids, but we don't have to say that that's a fait accompli and that there's no review of that decision. And so we are more and more explicit about that in our resolution agreements with districts, where they need to come back and report to us about what they've done, and we are at least a backstop on what those decisions are for kids, which I think is really important. And then just one last example from Georgia, there was a school district that just had a categorical rule that students with disabilities couldn't be part of their higher regular coursework programs. Their college ready program is called AVID there. And they just said, you can't be in. So we had a student who had ADHD who wanted to participate in the program and was told he couldn't participate because he has ADHD. So the agreement with the district is that they have to admit any student without any prerequisite in that program who wants to be in the program, and they had to specifically advertise to the families with disabilities the availability of the program so they could participate. So again, really distressing fact pattern, but we're here to be a backstop and to make sure that all of our students can be included in all of our school programs as appropriate.
Another question that came through is, how are each of your offices engaging with the 4 White House initiatives for minority students to work on stigma of disability in those communities, discipline, and better inform parents and families?
So I'll start just because I had the microphone most recently, but so here I am. But as Melody said, we are really thrilled about the ways that we are able to work in partnership across the Department of Education and across this administration. So it's been really fun on all of our dimensions to be able to work with all of our partners. And the initiatives that we have, I'm really excited that we have them. B, they're terrific partners in sharing our message, in raising new issues that wouldn't necessarily have come to us through our regular complaint process or through the networks that we're most active in. And being able to come together to find new avenues for the bully pulpit and for public presentations like this. So we work together in every way possible, and on lots of really obvious crossover. We've recently put out guidance related to students with disabilities. With the initiatives, we're doing a lot of work about bullying issues in general that is inclusive of students with disabilities, and so every dimension that we can, we're working with them, and it's a terrific partnership.
Yeah, so in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Ed, we have 100 programs that go from pre-K through high school. We have some that actually go into the university level. And as Catherine and Melody both mentioned, it's great to be incredible partners. I feel like I'm flanked by 2 brilliant people, and that their ability to have their staff engaged in a lot of our work is just so essential to what we do. So one of our biggest programs that we have is ESEA flexibility, and we have 40-something states who already have flexibility from No Child Left Behind. And a couple of key pieces on that are, we have both the Office of Civil Rights and Special Education who sit on our flex teams, who are always looking for ways in which we're ensuring that people are engaged in the work, and most especially, and it kind of relates back to the prior question as well, is that one of the requirements of a state receiving ESEA flexibility is actually stakeholder engagement. And what we're finding across the country is that some states are really, really good about reaching out to various groups, whether it's civil rights groups, special education advocacy groups, et cetera, and others not so much. I mean, a state will say, yeah, we had stakeholder engagement, and when we look at it or investigate it, it's, a piece of a notice that went up out of the state superintendent's office that was on page 7 of a 9-page document. And it's like 1 paragraph. Well, that's not really engagement, and I don't even know if you classify that as true communication, but that's another thought. But anyway, so like those are pieces that are really, really critical. So all of our programs are really focused in on an equity agenda, all of them, all 100 of them. Whether we're dealing with migrant ed kids, or we're dealing with homeless and neglected and delinquent youth, or whatever, all of them are focused on this equity issue. So it's really vital that we continue to partner and hopefully model across the country what it is that we're doing at the federal level. We also redesigned our SASA office, which is where Title I was housed, to the Office of State Support. We have special ed folks who sit in on that group, so that now every state will have 1 state lead. So you can no longer call the department and ask 17 people, get 17 different answers, and choose the one you really like. That's sort of the bad news. So having been on the other side as a superintendent, that would be a bummer for me. But we're trying to make it easier for states, especially SEAs, to navigate around all of our system. And one of our primary goals, which we hope to achieve in the next few years, is to look at every federal dollar that flows into a state and help that state think about one continuous improvement plan focused on all kids, all meaning all, and figuring out how to braid some of that funding, how to harness some of that funding in better kinds of ways, and be sure that everyone is aware of how those funds can actually be used.
I had a follow-up question for Catherine, actually. If advocates in a district or state have tried everything and are out of options for getting kids what they need, how do they involve your office?
So first, you can involve our office before you try everything also, so you don't have to wait that long. But you can, we have 12 regional offices around the country. You can go to the offices in person, you can go to our website, you can call the offices to let them know. We take complaints in any form, and we investigate every complaint over which we have jurisdiction. So if something happens in a school and it is discriminatory and it has happened within the last 180 days, or the continuing effects of it have taken place within the last 180 days, we will open it and we will investigate. We receive about 10,000 complaints a year, so we have a very high volume of complaints that are already coming in. Just under 50% of those complaints are complaints related to students with disabilities, and that's some hovering around the 50%, a little over 50%, has been true for us for the past decade and more, so it's a very high volume of the kinds of complaints that we receive. We also have proactive compliance reviews that we initiate, so sometimes if for some reason something doesn't come into us through a complaint, but there's a set of community concerns or something that we know about from conferences like this, from other ways that we find the information, we go after to look for the issues ourselves too. So please share the information with us. Let us know what the concerns are if it is about a specific kid. Also, we don't have a standing requirement, so it doesn't have to be your child, your family that has been impacted by the issue. You can know about the issue and be concerned about it and believe that it violates the law, and we will investigate. So it's a pretty loose standard. It can be on the back of a napkin. It can be on the internet. It can be through the phone. We want to know what the issues are, and we will investigate.
And I think we have time. I'm going to make an executive decision. Time to address one more question. How are schools, states, and the Department of Education addressing the issues of higher rates of segregation, less inclusion of African American students with disabilities?
So is the question how schools and states are addressing it?
And the Department of Ed, yeah.
So I'm not well positioned to talk about how schools and states are addressing it, mostly from the perspective of what I see is that it's not that good. But I'm not sure that that's a fair characterization. I tend to see complaints. So maybe my colleagues can speak to that better than I can on that point. But on what we do about the issue is we come at this with the level of aggression that we come at every other issue that comes in front of us. So the less inclusion for students of one population is a deep concern, but if it was equal non-inclusion for every student, that would be a deep concern for us. The issue for us is take our kids and make sure that they receive equitable opportunity in school. And whatever the inequity is, we want to be there as the ultimate backstop, and we're very serious about that. We're very serious about using every lever that we have to make sure that we deliver for every student who needs us. And so we use the data Sunlight that we've highlighted here. That's been really a very, very meaningful tool in terms of changing practices around the country. Just the making the data more public, making it more accessible to more families, making sure that we highlight the disparities that we've been talking about today. Then we also put out the guidance about what the law is, how we expect to enforce it, what it is that we're wanting to do about it, and then we've made our own enforcement practices much more transparent, so that a year ago when I started, we had probably about 100 resolution agreements up on our website, and they were representative examples of kinds of things that we had done. Now, a year later, we have more than 500 resolution agreements up on our website. It's our policy now that we are posting virtually everything. The only resolution agreements that we wouldn't post are those that there's just no way to protect the privacy interests of the families involved. And so there's a very tiny subset that we don't post. Otherwise, everything's up, and that means that school districts, state policymakers, families, anybody can see what it is that we ask for when we enter into resolution agreements, what it is that we think is wrong, what it is that we expect of our schools. And so I think it's allowed more people who want to comply with the law to know how to comply with the law, and it's allowed more people who maybe haven't been as actively desiring to comply with the law to know that we may well come for them, and so that there's greater incentive to come into compliance. And so we really are trying to use every tool that we have to make sure that we deliver for every kid who needs us.
Thanks. One of the things I would add to that is just for your point of reference, which I think is a really important one, is that the department is actually required to collect plans for equitable distribution of teachers. And those have not been called in since 2006. So we are calling those in June of 2015. And I would highly encourage you to engage with your SEA to figure out what's being done to that. The reason why that's so important, so when you go to the school and the district level, what's so important about that is we know from data that students of color and students living in poverty have less access to high quality teachers and have a higher proportion of teachers who are transient in their lives. You know, teachers who come in and out of their lives for 1 or 2 years, which is not helpful to the school culture. And students with disabilities also suffer from that same kind of data. So we are calling in those plans and asking states to look at where the gaps exist with high quality teachers and leaders, by the way, and to do something about it. So we've had some pushback, as you can well imagine, people feeling as though they don't know what to do. And what's particularly important in this agenda and for this particular initiative is the fact that while it's hard in urban centers and even suburban centers, it is super hard in rural and isolated areas. So where we're getting a tremendous amount of angst, if you will, from state education officers is what do they do when it's very difficult to attract and retain teachers and leaders in rural and isolated regions, because generally those teachers are paid less than their counterparts in other parts of the state. You know, there's this whole issue of if you have a partner, a spouse, where do they get a job in those areas? So that's a really critical piece, and I don't want us to surface up when these plans come in that the only kids we're attending to are kids in urban areas, because there's a greater population of teachers who are available to them.
Great. Thank you. So our final question to consider today is what would it take to get quality instruction in every classroom for every student? We have 2 presenters on this question. So first I would like to introduce Kurt Schneider. Connie is going first. Okay, so first I would like to introduce Connie Gardner, the Policy Director, Practice Leader at Foley Hoag. Come on. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's good to see some of the folks that I haven't seen for a while. I appreciate being here, and I appreciate Kurt switching places with me. I actually have another session that started at 9:40 on managed care that I need to get to, so I'll make my comments a little fast. The perspective that I'm coming here with today, and a lot of you know that I worked for Ted Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, for 18 years. And was his policy director for disability and special populations. So part of my perspective as I come here today will be from all of the lessons that I had learned over those 18 years, and then the years prior to that when I was at the Department of Education in Oasters, before I went up to Capitol Hill. The other perspective that brings me to where I'm at is my work as a practicing pediatric and neonatal nurse practitioner, which is what I always have continued to do. And the similarities between nursing and education, which was a little bit begun to be pointed out, are huge. Everything across the board, from the profession and its recognition, to the pay scales, to the challenges with, is someone prepared when they come out of school really? Have people learn by imitation, or have they learned by real experience? Can they document are they documenting by imitation? Are they really documenting as a result of knowing what the underpinnings are of why people are and why they do what they do? And so there's a lot of similarity between those 2 professions, and it would be really nice at some point if they merged a little bit of their effort, particularly politically, about how to move policies forward that affect children, families, and those 2 professions together, but I think they're very much alike. So some of my perspective will be that. And then the other perspective that I bring, which is my most important one, is from my 7 kids that I have. I have 4 boys and 3 girls, and so I've had, and one of whom does have a disability. My daughter, who is now 20, and she had viral encephalitis when she was 6 weeks old. So she's had insidious developmental delay over time, and so we don't label her because there's no real reason to. And I do want to reinforce this issue of the labels. But she got a lot of scatter, and so, she really does have significant cognitive disabilities. But I will tell you, on the employment end of things, she's been working. I pulled her out, actually, of IDEA when she was 18. This was after doing the last reauthorization, because that was my responsibility in 2003 and 4. I took her out, and the reason I took her out was because those last 3 years of IDEA, in my estimation, didn't give her what she needed. And what we really needed was what we did put in the legislation, and I'm not sure whatever happened with it. I've asked Michael Uden several times to get some feedback. Did anyone in the world take up the idea of doing a 3-year IEP? When someone is 18 to 22 years old, those last 3 years that the kids are in school, and say, where do you want to be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years from now, and work that plan backwards. So it's not the moving forward of the traditional IEP year after year. So someday we'll find out what happened with that and whether it managed to do anything. But so I've had some interesting experiences with those kids, and I am going to share with you part of my experience last night, because my kids were kind of like 3 years apart, all of them. And that's what a good Catholic girl does that marries a nice Jewish doctor, right? He still has not recovered from this. But these kids are like 3 years apart, right? So my oldest one is fun. He's a brand new first-year principal. And he took this principal job, and I just sort of shook my head. His background, they all played baseball. All my boys played college baseball. And 3 of them are still in there, and then this guy's out. But has this brand new job as a new principal, has been an assistant for a while, and a construction project at the very same time. So it's been very fun to watch him. So when I heard, and I drive by him every day, and I see the days he's really frustrated, and he's out directing traffic like the Geico commercial, in front of the school, and that's, I think, his stress relief. But I really have high expectations for him because he has a sister with a disability, and he's had to live with me over the last 20 years doing all this various work in terms of disability policy. And he's frustrated. And so last night when I was looking at this, a very large question that Kurt and I have been asked to address, I actually was at IHOP, and I'm going to just hold this up for you and share with you. So I called him. So here I'm at IHOP. So here's the thing, right, the menu thing. And I had my daughter with a disability with me, and the more I thought about it, the more I really, there's a bunch of like 6 kids here, and it says 1 + 1 is 2. I really thought, well, this is really the answer to my question. This is what I want to see every day. But I called him up on the phone, and I said, Greg, I said, this is a good question for you. You're a new principal. What do you think? And for the next 45 minutes in IHOP, he did not stop in terms of what he thought would help make a classroom show and really have the good instruction for all kids that were in the classroom. And we really went at it from an all kids point of view. So I did get some representation from him last night for whatever that was worth for me, but it was fun. So those are the perspectives I bring when I come. And again, I think nurses, again, and teachers really have an awful lot in common. I want to start just with a small little story for me coming from the parent point of view. With regard to this question of good instruction for all kids, because those are the key terms. Good instruction, all kids, in a classroom where everybody benefits from each other. I'm going to stay away from the word LRE and all the 50-cent buzzwords that we always use, because it doesn't matter sometimes for real people at the end of the food chain. So let's just talk about what they actually really mean. And so I can remember one year when 3, because my kids are so close together, all three of them were in the same school. And my daughter was in the Gifted and Talented program, which was very awesome. She came home the first day of school. She had a curriculum that didn't look anything like any other curriculum I had ever seen. I went to Catholic school in Philadelphia. And she was very creative. Didn't go to a classroom, went to like one of the things out in the parking lot, and they created their own world out there, in the van that they had redone. They created their own city, their own world. They really awesome. And the homework was out-of-the-box thinking. Right? It wasn't a report that she was to write. It was, how do you take everything that you learned and put it into a cartoon? How do you play it out like that? So real creative, out-of-the-box kinds of strategies. Number 2 kid came home who was in regular education, and he was very traditional, math, reading, science, just kind of like you usually do. And then my daughter with the disability came home with an empty school bag for 3 months. And even though we had meetings and we talked about the IEP, we talked about the things that mattered to me, which were not the pieces of paper. It was about how are you, the school, and the teacher going to own her success? How are you going to do that? Don't tell me about rules, laws, I know about those. You tell me how you're going to earn her success the 6 hours a day that I'm not here. But still, that school bag came home an empty school bag. And so I do have a draft of an article that I play around with every once in a while called The Empty School Bag. But what was very interesting for me was how all 3 of those young people in the same school, under the same schoolhouse roof, were really approached in a very different way. And my question always was, isn't there a way to take the best of all 3 of those worlds and put them together for all of them? So at least after dinner, they'd have something to talk about. At least after dinner, they'd have something to share back and forth. Ashley, with the empty school bag, didn't really have very much to share with her brother and sister who were part of that school at that time. So that gave me a lot of perspective in thinking about the, kind of maybe challenges that we would need to address over time. When I think about quality education, though, in the classroom, there's a couple things I think that we can learn from other areas of the human service system out there right now that we need to think maybe a little differently about. I think we've learned, and you've heard in this conference and many of the sessions that you've been in this one here today, the real value of all kids, whether they're children with disabilities, whether they're regular ed kids, whether they're the English learning children, how effective it is for everyone to be together and learn together. So, and we call it least restrictive environment, but I think that's what we're trying to say. Everybody really ought to be on a level playing field and have the same kinds of learning opportunities that everyone else has. For IDEA, that's always sort of been couched in children with disabilities being educated where non-disabled children are educated and have those same kinds of expectations and experiences. Okay. I think we need to take some lessons now off of where CMS has gone with a very good definition of what the word community and community-based services mean. For the first time, they have said, we don't want to talk about places anymore. We don't want to talk about nursing homes. We don't want to talk about independent living. We don't want to talk about what a place should be. We want to talk about what works for that individual to help them be the very best that they can be. So it begins to get into some of the earlier conversation here where it's not just about the place, it's about what happens in the place. It's about the quality of the education that was talked about here. And I think we need to think about that when we think about young people with disabilities in environments where they are included like everyone else. It's not just about the place. It's about what really happens in there and how to make that, from an instruction point of view, matter even more. So I think that definition of community is really kind of important, and it's going to begin to frame and get us where we need to go as a disability movement, of which education is just one thread. And we can't be continuing to think about things in the silos that we do. And I think that is representative in classrooms, the silo kind of approach. And so I think, we need to think a little bit differently about that. The Miss Wendell, she did it all. She did project-based learning. She went out and she looked at the strengths and weaknesses of those young boys from the social-emotional point of view. And what pieces did that play in the actual outcome of their educational learning? She had group commitment. And she made sure that there was a group commitment to the kids in the class as well as her students with disabilities, because she had them all part of the problem-solving process for them. Okay, she also had the parental commitment. So whoever did the description of that example did a good job of hitting all the different pieces that you would really want to have. But that just doesn't come naturally. And I am going to write a letter over to those who monitor, because there is a school sitting right in the middle of Virginia, in Harrisonburg, Virginia, that is used as an internship site for the special education programs at a university that's located there. That school will not let kids with disabilities in their physical education program. It doesn't matter that that's the right of, it's a mandate in the particular grade school. It doesn't matter that that's what they said, no, kids with disabilities are not coming into this program because we're not going to take the liability of those children getting hurt. Okay, now that's who your teacher training program in that particular area, which is, I would argue, looking around the programs, is a pretty good program. But that's where they're subjected to have to go. So role modeling, that's what they're going to see. They would be like the nurses that I have to work with who have come from places where they've learned by imitation, but they don't have any idea why they're doing what they're doing because they don't understand the physiology underneath what's happened here. So we have an obligation to make sure from an educational point of view that that's not the place where the internship takes place. Because when you say they're not ready when they come out, well, they're not ready because that's what's their role model. And that is right, 60 miles from here. So you will get my letter. Since I don't go to school there and I don't have it, but you'll get my letter on that. Because I think that's representative of the kinds of things that kind of we can do a little bit different. But I think where things really are important is in the curriculum, the instruction, the teacher training, I think is just so incredibly important. So that teachers come out with the skills they need to do exactly what Miss Wendell did because she knew how to differentiate. And it's really about learning the skill of differentiation. How do you learn those skills so that you can look at a classroom, or I can look at a nursing unit with a bunch of people with the same diagnosis? They're not all the same. One appendectomy is not the same as the other. One LD kid is not the same as the other. One kid with autism isn't the same as the other. So ABA really may not work for every kid. You know, it's not the be-all, end-all. It may not work for every kid. We got 4 people with Ebola out there now. They were all treated differently. Okay, one thing doesn't work for every single person. And so we have a large charge, I think, in teacher training to help people leave with the skills of differentiation when they go into a classroom. And I think that will help with this notion of including all different kinds of kids, not just kids with disabilities, into classrooms and have them have successful educational experiences. You need resource. What do you need to be able to do that in the classroom? And I'm building it from the bottom up. I'll be right down. Resources, we have professional development. You got to give the teachers the flexibility to be able to do this. And there's a little bit of a rub, I think, that goes into flexibility, creativity, individualizing, and standardized testing, because it's a snapshot. It's an absolute snapshot at one point in time. So if we got to do it because the Wizard of Oz says that's the way we're going to measure success, it can't be the only tool out there. Okay, it is a one snapshot deal. It would be like, again, me coming and taking your temperature at 11 o'clock at night and saying you're fine, and at 6 in the morning you're in an intensive care unit. It's a snapshot in time. And so it doesn't really represent how children really learn. So I think that that's an important thing for us to consider. So when you go up to the state level, since we were supposed to do 3 levels, what would I suggest at the state level? People need resources. Schools can't do this without resources. We always say that. It always turns out to be money. But you know what? States could do a better job of coordinating the individual silo funding streams they have now to bring to the school, not a burden, but to bring to the school the resources they need to do their job better. And I would argue there's a couple of mental health, big one. There are streams and streams of local, federal, state, and dollars out there for mental health that are designated for kids. We don't bring that to where kids are each day, to the school. We expect the teachers and the principal and everybody else to be able to manage all that stuff. Okay, we don't bring those in. We really don't coordinate and bring them in. And so I think, and that's just an example of one. I mean, we'll talk over time about voc rehab and their role in middle school, not when somebody's 18 and a half years old. So those, and the employment supports that are out there, so those are the kinds of things that we really want to be able to see happen at the state level. And at the federal level, I'm going to ask the families that are in the room, let them have the respect and the dignity of risk, and let them have it to be able to ask the hard questions around policy questions to get to where we need to go. Okay, if I ever get back and do this legislative stuff again, because I did 2 IDEA things, I want us to sit and think about what program integration, not alignment, but how would you integrate IDEA and No Child Left Behind? How would you do that? I mean, what are we doing? What are we doing here under the schoolhouse roof? We reauthorize these things, they got rules that change this day, and then we expect that we're going to get some kind of quality for our kid. I want us to seriously think about what are the pros and cons of being able to integrate, not align those two programs. Does it mean the rights have to be lost? Okay, there's ways to do that and still maintain rights, but still integrate those programs. And the regular ed kids can really benefit a lot from what we have in special ed. Maybe we ought to have an IEP for everybody. Maybe that's really what we ought to have. But I'm just saying, let them have the dignity of risk to ask those questions without saying, can't bring it up because the groups will get upset. All right, you don't get good legislation by doing those kind of things. So I'm going to ask you to, from a family point of view, to do that. Think about the labels. When Arnie Duncan said to me, if you had one thing you would do in IDEA, what would you do from the federal level? I'd get rid of those labels. They don't matter. They don't matter. How many teachers care? I mean, that's a diagnosis. Who cares? You know, does it matter what the kid comes with? Does it matter when I say my kid has Fragile X or whatever they have? It doesn't matter. All that matters is what happens the 6 hours a day they're in that classroom. So why aren't we looking at function as opposed to labels, other than labels make it easy to drive resources? And I think we had a little bit of that earlier in terms of the discussion around labels. Let them ask that question. What would happen if we got rid of labels? What would really happen? And what would it look like? And then the third thing I would argue is, from a federal level and a state level, build out the early intervening provision in IDEA, because you've got it there for all kids. It's a one piece that drives those two programs together because it works for both sides. How can we build that out? So those are the comments that I would have about how to make a classroom work for everybody and make sure our kids, from a universal design that we care about, get everything they need. So thank you for having me. And Kurt, thank you for letting me go first.
Thank you so much, Connie. I know who I want to go to dinner with after this conference. I want to go to dinner with the mayor of DC and Connie Gardner. That would be a very great conversation. So thank you. That was a big question and really required a lot to answer and talk about. So Kurt, I'd like to have Kurt come up, and Kurt is an assistant superintendent for Learning Community Consolidated School in District 181 in Hinsdale. Am I saying that right? Hinsdale, Illinois. And he is going to also be addressing this question.
So how do you take all of what we heard in the last hour and a half and at the school district level make it all happen? And so that's the pleasure that I get to try to address here in 3 to 5 minutes. So the perspective that I come from is one at the local level, where as deputy superintendent we're on this journey. And you know, I want to start off by saying though, but prior to my current role, doing some similar work in Wisconsin in a school district called Stoughton, which is one of the districts identified as a SWIFT school. And so whether that has been in my work as a administrator in a suburban, rural type of district, or whether this has been doing the work where I was working with Chicago Public Schools, with Lou Brown in the late 90s, or whether that's as a special education teacher at a high school, and now in an affluent area in the Chicago metropolitan area, the work is the same. And so the challenges, though, are different, and the political contexts are different, and the belief systems are different, and the values that people come into play are different. And so you have to figure out how to navigate that, and what is the entry point in each of those situations that you're going to use to sort of crack open this conversation. And so one of the points that Connie made, which was she had referenced, I think it was her daughter who came home and kind of was part of the sort of gifted program. And that was actually the door that we're using in our district to be able to, what we're calling, teach up. And so the issues that we had around gifted education have actually been the conversation starter to better improve instructional practices for all of our students. And so I wanted to bring that context to you because I think oftentimes, and depending on where you come from, there's sort of the mindset that I may not be urban enough, or I may not be suburban enough, or I may be too affluent, or I may be too blah, 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 and we use that as an excuse to keep people from the conversation. In doing any of this work, I think it's important to have a framework, because at the end of the day, really, all we're saying is every child deserves their best teacher, Every child deserves to be able to go to the school that they should be able to go to in their neighborhood. Every child deserves to have a high-quality curriculum. And everyone, if you need something a little extra love, how do you do that and deliver that integrated service right within the classroom? And that's really all this is, and we make it way too complicated. And so to do that, to simplify it, I think there's sort of a mindset that you have to bring to it. And one is, if you consider sort of a series of rings. And at the center of that ring, I think, is the notion that we talked about at the beginning, which is the whole presuming competence in the belief system. And that's easier said than done. And that whole growth mindset versus having more of a fixed mindset, as Carol Dweck talks about, and as we heard Norma talk about this morning. And that's easier said than done. Because depending on the demographic or the cultural or economic or sexuality or whatever perspective or lens that you bring, there's assumptions and biases that come into that. And you have to work with your faculty and your systems and your parents and your communities to be able to really understand their own biases and prejudices to be able to move your system forward. And so that when kids truly come through the door, that we really have that understanding of how to meet their needs. And so there's a whole lot of professional development that has to go just into that piece. From there, then you also have to get into your curriculum, because at the end of the day, like I said, it's really about instruction. And so, but to do that, you have to really align your curriculum to the Common Core, and you have to believe that all students can be able to do that and understand what those essential targets are at the end of the day. And just even helping your staff even know what the targets are, what the Common Core is also really important and significant work. Then you have to align all of your instructional practices and differentiate your instruction, or whether you call that universal design, and you have to teach people how to do that. And then you have to take, again, like I said, all of those services, that little extra love that some kids may need, and work with your staff on the delivery of that service to be right within the context of the classroom. And so we call that all hands on deck, and making sure that you're really using your resources to be able to support and drive classroom instruction that supports all those kids. And again, just within that ring, if you will, there's a whole lot of work to be able to do right there. And then you got to give your teachers time to collaborate. You have to provide them with job-embedded coaching. You have to really look at your data over time, and you have to look at it regularly. And so you have to work with your principals. So in my case, making sure that all of my principals have school improvement plans that actually mean something and that are actually based upon their data, and that they're regularly looking at their data regularly during the course of the year and adjusting their plans as they see fit. And then aligning your teacher evaluation systems and your, in our case, our Danielson framework, to be able to make sure that we're holding staff accountable to be able to differentiate that instruction, deliver those services in an integrated way, and make sure that those are all aligned to the belief system and the vision and the direction of your systems. And then finally, you have to develop the structures that you need to be able to do to be able to educate your parents, you have to be able to educate your community, and you really have to educate your school boards. And so part of the conversations that I want to be able to have when I get back is further conversations with our school boards about our school board, making sure that we're all in alignment from boardroom to classroom. And that in of itself is a lot of work, because as we gear up for different board elections at different points in time, making sure that people who now enter the system are brought up to speed. And so that's all part of how you make this systems change process that doesn't happen overnight. And so in summary, I think there's some significant supports that are helpful at the local level to be able to make this all work. And I think first and foremost, having conversations, as Connie was talking about, of merging IDEA and No Child Left Behind into one, because what happens at the local level is we created all these silos. And those silos have fragmented our parents, they've fragmented our kids, they fragmented our teachers, and they fragmented our funding sources. And so it really handcuffs at a local level what needs to get done. And yet then we expect school districts to turn around and deliver integrated supports and instruction to kids. So that's one. I think we need to re-examine the whole notion of this continuum. I think people use that as a crux. To be able to, because if you have that, bias and that assumption, that cultural context not necessarily fleshed out, and so you can bring that lens to that continuum conversation, and you can use that as a justification for making sure that students aren't part of the classroom and aren't accessing the curriculum. And so I think we need to seriously rethink that piece. I think we need federal direction to states to really look at re-examining the divisions of these silos, and how do we take those silos and strengthen that core instruction. And making sure to do that, you have to professionally develop all of your staff and all of your parents. And in addition, we really need to talk about how do we professionally develop our hearing officers so that when school districts like ours challenge and want to support kids in an inclusive way, not get penalized and further directed to segregate students when we do want to do the right thing. And so I think that's really important. So all of those things in summary, I think, are how you do all of this to this particular question. I'm pleased to be part of the conversation, and it's an honor to be here. I'm proud of the work that we're doing in Illinois in our district, and it's great to be part of this national conversation.
Thank you. So, Deb, we would love to have you start, if you feel comfortable, on kind of addressing this big question of what would it take to get quality instruction in every classroom.
Sure, thanks. And I feel like this has been my life's work, what happens in classrooms and what happens in schools, so I'm really going to try to honor the attribute of brevity here. This whole issue, I've always lived my professional life by one mantra, which is what we offer to our kids tells them what it is that we value. And I just think that this is at the heart of this question. And I would actually add a phrase in here, what's not just what would it take to get quality instruction in every classroom, but also how do we get supports in every single school so that all kids feel that they're a part of a successful learning environment and they can find their places within that school. One of the great parts of my position is I get, very similar to Melody, get to travel all over the country to visit all kinds of schools. And I have to say, unless this happens to you, people don't bring me to the bad places, right? They don't say come to see these terrible classrooms. So I just see absolutely amazing things going on in schools across America. And what I feel bad about is that those stories aren't being told in the media. It's a sensationalism of the one teacher, the one principal, the one school district, what happened to one kid kind of thing. But every time I walk into a school, I have one question in my mind. And that question is this school good enough for my own kid? Because if the answer to that question is no, then I don't understand why we allow that school to be okay for other people's kids. I'm really serious about this. But when we have conversations like this, I want us to not forget just one simple fact. Kids get it. So when we have lower expectations for kids, we're not pulling the wool over their eyes, they get it. So when I think about, what we offer to our kids tells them what it is that we value. We actually are telling kids that they're diminished in our eyes. They're not worth it. We can't have higher expectations. And the conversation around the country right now on higher standards, forget if it's Common Core, if it's college and career-ready standards, it's always like, what are you going back to? Were our kids doing so great before? But the concerns that I have right now is the way we're dividing out kids and saying, well, we don't expect that our students with disabilities are going to, they're all the same, that they're going to be able to achieve at a really high level. Really, so you didn't even try to raise expectations for kids, but you're predicting that this is not going to happen. So I think, Kurt, you laid out a really nice set of what actually has to happen within school settings. And I want to just lift it up a little bit more and emphasize just a couple of things. And I would say this is not rocket science. We do not need one more blue ribbon task force to figure out what to do. We know what to do. It's just, do we have the willingness to actually do this? The first was stated earlier, changes in teacher prep programs and also principal prep programs. Those have got to change. They've got to incorporate more clinical experiences with a wide array of kids. My undergraduate program was in a small school in New England, and I feel like it was when the earth was still cooling. I went to teacher prep program. But I started as a second-year student. We were on trimesters. Every trimester, I was in a different kind of school, and I couldn't repeat. I had to go to a school that was an isolated special education building. I had to be in an urban setting. I worked with migrant kids out of Hartford in tobacco fields. So it just was imperative, and those are the lessons that really brought me to my own philosophy that differentiation is absolutely critical for kids, and personalization. But because I was able to see in all those experiences, I didn't go to schools that were just like the ones in which I grew up. So that's number one. Kurt mentioned this, I can't underestimate targeted and focused professional development. We expect our teachers to do everything the best they can on day one on the job, and that is just totally unfair. None of us would go to a cardiac surgeon if they hadn't been to the most recent innovative practice seminar, school, class. We wouldn't do that, but we expect our teachers to do the same. So that's the second. The third is leaders who have the conviction and skills and attitudes to take on challenging environments. This whole leadership issue is just really one of significant concern for me. So one of our programs is School Improvement Grant Program, and we've spent about $6 billion to try to turn around the lowest performing schools. Those are hard places. There's a significant number of kids with disabilities in those schools, and about a third of those kids are also EL kids. What's problematic in there is those principals are changing all the time because they don't have the skills to take that on. And yet we want them to go in and do this bang-up job, turn around the school, and have it be a school that we would want to send to our own kids to. So we really have to do something on the leadership role, working with principals. As central office administrators, it's vital to support principals because they're the leader in that building, and they get caught in a lot of managerial tasks. Now, I remember being a school principal and one time thinking, like, why am I spending my time picking out who the school photographer is? But that seemed to be a big deal for everybody, and I had to make a decision about it. So the more that we can get principals to share leadership roles with teachers and have this truly distributed leadership model is really important. Kurt mentioned one on differentiation, which I think is really so critical, obviously moving into personalization of learning experiences. And then I think Melody brought it up earlier, and I know Catherine has been such an advocate for this, and that's being aware of all the disciplinary issues that occur and how they impact students with disabilities, students of color, and kids living in poverty. And I'll just tell one brief story, because I felt so bad for this mom. I was in Texas, and it was just when we were collecting the data, the OCR data. And this mom, she had a kindergartner, African-American kindergartner, who that week had been expelled for 5 days for pulling the fire alarm. 2 weeks earlier, a white 9th grade boy in the same school district went to half a day in school suspension for the exact same thing. How do we allow that to happen and not call it out? So I think, Melody, you mentioned get aware of the data in your state. It's readily available on our site, on state site, but that has an impact on kids in the supportive learning environment. So obviously I have a passion for this. I can go on and on and on and on. The one big thing I'd say is to look at every policy in a school district, because if you look at a vision statement that they have, I can guarantee you all is in there somewhere. All kids will graduate, all kids will do this. I can tell you I haven't met one school district yet, including the one I was a superintendent in, that didn't have some policy that actually worked against that. So you've got to be a really big advocate and call it out. You may not be the most popular person in your community or school district, but we have got to call out these sessions, these situations, and say, look, I wouldn't stand this for my own kid, so it's not right for somebody else's kid.
So we have a question here that says, are any plans in the works to support discretionary grants promoting high school inclusion?
So, our discretionary grants are funded, for specific purposes. All of our programs are designed to, support more inclusive practices, whether it's in teacher preparation or SWIFT, but SWIFT is an elementary project, so, we have considered whether we should expand SWIFT to, maybe a high school project as well. Actually, our Part B funds have been steadily declining, so we really don't have any new money right now. We're just going to be able to sustain the grants that we've already funded, so, but that's definitely something I'd be interested in.
Another question from our participants. Will the new teacher evaluation requirements assess how effectively general educators teach students with disabilities?
I'm going to say hopefully. Such a bureaucratic response. And I'm saying that because every state has an opportunity to design their own system. So the part that we play in that is, especially as part of ESEA flexibility, is that we are really pushing, as OSERS has done, to an outcomes-based setting. So when we look at a state's waiver, we may not get into the exact nuances of, what exactly is in the teacher and principal evaluation. But because student growth has to be included as a significant factor within those evaluation systems, we also collect data on all of the subpopulations. So we would be aware through monitoring of a disproportionality of, for example, with students, if their teachers are all excelling at high rates. The other piece that we actually look at through monitoring, and we're actually working with states to redefine, is that there is a provision within the flex waiver that no teachers cannot get the same rating, the highest rating, if their student growths are dissimilar. So if the three of us were exemplary in our professional practices, for example, but my student growth was really low, I cannot get that highest rating that Melody and Catherine would get because their student growth is pretty significant. So there are ways through monitoring we do that, but there's also this local control over what happens within the metric system in that teacher evaluation.
And this will probably be our last question, and it's directed to you, Deb. How can we incentivize or train principals to become inclusive education leaders?
Become what? I'm sorry.
To become the inclusive education leaders that we're looking for.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things come to mind right away. We actually have a competitive grant program that is just up and running. We've just awarded several SEAs and LEAs, and it's on the School Turnaround Leaders program. So we just have really kind of re-emphasized, especially principals in this administration. There'd been a lot of focus on teachers and the quality of teachers prior to this year, and now we're really focusing on principals. So that's one example. We're really looking to get key strategies out that we could share with the field, because I think those principals, PLES, will be great for all, PALS, for all principals. The other piece is to really, one of the things I found out as a superintendent, and it was jarred by something either Melody or Catherine said, is that I sometimes didn't recognize the power that I had as a consumer of teacher and principal prep programs. So I was in the Cleveland area, and we had gotten together as superintendents for the 15 districts contiguous to Cleveland to go to all the teacher and principal prep training programs that primarily fed our school districts, and said, look, if you want us to interview your graduates, whether principals or teachers, this is what we expect. And that was really powerful, because we never realized that we were actually the clients of these folks, and we had an opportunity to do that. So I think we've got to step up to the plate and do that more. I think we also have to lift up, whether it's through this organization, through the federal system, practices that are really, really working in sharing all of those narratives where principals are inclusive, and bring those together. So we've orchestrated some peer-to-peer networks. Would love to do one on this particular topic, where we bring people together who are actually doing this work to share their practices, and then write up those stories and send those out so other people can jar their thinking and like, oh wait, maybe I can do this as well, or maybe it's not as hard as I thought it was going to be.
Great, thank you so much. So as we come to a close, we'd love to offer each of you final thoughts, if you have anything else you'd like to add before we close up.
So it's easy to see why I love working with these two amazing women, because they are totally committed and they get it, and we just have a great chemistry, I think, and a great partnership, so I value it so much. I can't disagree with anything that has been said here today. I think these things are all so important as we think about what can we do to transform our learning environments moving forward. The last thing I just want to say really quickly is that our new accountability framework in special education, results-driven accountability, is a work in progress. You know, we've just started this year for the first time using student outcomes in our determination process for states. But again, we're reviewing that, and that's going to change over time. And we really need everyone paying attention to what are the best data elements to use in our results matrix that can tell us and can tell states how effectively are we educating kids with disabilities. What are the right data elements that we should be using? So we'll really appreciate your help in thinking through that, because it's really complicated. So thank you for being here.
Thanks as well, and I want to give a thank you to you for hanging in here for 2 hours with us. It's great. And also you could see why, as Melody said, I'm just so enamored with these two folks. They help me to be a better me. You know, one of the things we didn't talk about today was a lot about data, and this is one thing I've worried about over the last several years, whether at the district, state, or even now at the federal level. I feel like we've become so enamored with data. And I go into schools all the time, and if you go into teachers' lounges, you see data walls all up, and you know, that's great, and data's important. But what I fear is that we get so caught up in the data, we forget that behind every piece of data is the heart and soul of a child who really, really wants to be respected and who wants to succeed. So anything we can do to bring that to fruition is really clear. You know, and when I talk to groups of educators, I will always say, you know, I'll go in and see number 94123 is not really progressing, but somebody needs to know who 94123 is. And if you're not willing to do the work, at least have the guts to walk into the classroom, find 94123 and say, you know, I just don't have the energy to work for you on behalf of you, and then go get a job at Walmart as a greeter. But seriously, let's not forget there is the heart and soul of a child behind every piece of data, and every one of those kids is worthy of all of our work.
So I'm going to pick up on that theme of love, and I obviously love working with my colleagues, but also Kurt's theme of love for the students, and that, you know, that what it would take to deliver the kinds of education that we want for our own children, for every child, is to deliver that love, that hope, that expectation, and that fierce insistence on now for those kids, that they don't get to do fourth grade over, they don't get to do their class time over, and so we need to insist on the high quality education for every child in every school, consistent with the really robust things that our federal civil rights laws demand for them. And so we should be prepared to deliver, and it's really exciting to be in conversation with all of you today, and to know that we are in conversation even when we're not together as you do the work in schools around the country. So thank you for it.
We want to thank all of our presenters today, federal partners and participants, for contributing to this discussion. I want to thank the Inclusive Education Committee, who has been working on the format for this for quite some time. We are confident that this forum and similar forums at the conference will help us move forward in providing high-quality educational opportunities for all students that support communication competence, quality instruction, and equitable educational experiences. The Inclusive Education Committee will be developing a white paper based on the discussion today, and you can go to the TASH website to get information of that as it comes to fruition. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you at other scheduled town halls today and tomorrow that address the topics of individualized supports, transition, and employment. And you'll find the time and location of those town halls on page 73 of the program. So please come back and join us for more discussions. Thank you.